Good afternoon, everybody. Today's session is all about using the guided course, the primary guided course, to engage and motivate pupils at the primary level. For those of you who already are Languagenut subscribers, you might have already had a good chance to have a look at the guided course. And if not, don't worry, we will be sort of giving you a full kind of overview of some of the games we have on the platform today. Today's lesson is all about games. I think we can all agree that at the primary level, one of the most important things is that we're sort of building enthusiastic language learners who are sort of, really keen and willing and looking forward to sort of continuing with their language journey. So yes, we're going to look at games and how they can be used to engage pupils in the primary classroom. And we're going to split it into sort of two halves. The first half, I'm going to look at sort of games, Languagenut games on the primary guided course, and how they might be used either as a front of class activity or sort of assigned to pupils. And then in the second half of the call, we'll be looking at more generic MFL games that feature in the course heavily, and again, this session is particularly useful for sort of early career teachers, or if you have less experience maybe of teaching languages in the primary classroom. So we'll be sort of explaining how those games work and how you can use them in your lessons. Obviously, if you are an experienced language teacher, do still stick with us. As with anything, it's nice always to just to get a reminder of some of those activities that might have sort of been gathering dust on the shelf for a few terms. So yes, first of all, we're going to look at the Languagenut games on the primary guided course. And before we go into that, I will just draw your attention to a couple of other webinars. There's one that we did a couple of weeks ago. This is actually the second in a series of webinars about the primary guided course. So some of you might have been with me on that Thursday, the 21st of September, which was more of an introduction to the course and how to get the most out of the different materials that surround it, such as the lesson plans, knowledge organisers, etc. So again, if you missed that and you'd like to get a recording of the webinar and get the PowerPoint from it, then do again just drop me an email. It's fiona@languagenut.com, and I can send those over to you after this session. And then coming up next week, we've got one final webinar in this series, which is all about using the primary guided course for a personalised learning experience. So looking at all of the support challenge activities we have in the course, and how you can use them with your pupils. So again, if you sign up to that and end up not being able to make it, don't worry, because we'll send a recording out afterwards. But yes, those are the two, and this is the middle of the series. So some of you will already be familiar with our sort of dashboard for our primary guided course. This is what you'll see when you log in. Where you'll select your class, language and the year group, and when you go into the course, you'll then obviously have the sort of dashboard for that year group. As I said, we're looking at games today, and we've got different types of lessons across the course that will have different games linked to them. The majority of our lessons are based around a vocabulary set, and therefore the games that are both embedded into the lessons and sort of suggested as sort of follow-up tend to be our vocabulary games. So that's, for example, this term 1.1 greetings week 1 will be a vocabulary lesson. We then also have phonics lessons built throughout the course, and our phonics activities are sort of a different set of games, all designed to sort of build pronunciation and build awareness of the sounds of the language. And finally, we have the sentence building weeks and competition building weeks at the end of every big term. And those are obviously more to do with bringing together the vocabulary lessons and using vocabulary at a sentence level, and therefore we've got another different set of games for sentence building. So huge amount of games and Languagenut games that you will see throughout the course, both embedded in the lessons and sort of as games that are available to students to play in their own time as well. So to get started, we'll just obviously quickly recap some of the vocabulary games that we have on the Languagenut platform. As you can see here, we've got a screenshot of what one of those games would look like embedded into our guided course in our slideshows for the lesson. And what we've decided to do with the lesson plans is sort of assume that because we've embedded the games into the slideshow, we've assumed therefore that most teachers are going to be doing the games as a sort of front of class activity. Obviously, if you do have students that use devices in class, or if you are a school that uses devices, there is the option to assign vocabulary to students before the lesson so that you can use that with them. But every one of our games that we use throughout the course are also embedded within the lesson plans and within the slides, so that you can do that as a front of class activity. And as we go through these games, I'll sort of talk about ideas for how you might conduct these games as a front of class activity, rather than having kids on their devices doing them on their own. So as I said, if you do want to assign vocabulary, so we're looking at vocabulary games for now, when you go into the Learn screen for that week's vocabulary, you can then click on Assign and then assign the full scale sort of set of Languagenut games related to that content to your students. When they then log into their platform, they'll then be able to see the different assignments, and as you can see, we've got 6 different activities that can be quizzed. However, when they go into those activities, so listening, they will then have the opportunity to practice that set of vocabulary across all of the different listening games or reading games, speaking and writing on Languagenut. So that's what that will look like for the students. Again, if you're somebody who's just bought the Languagenut Primary Guided Course, or you're sort of quite new to Languagenut, in terms of all of this admin and assignments area, we do have a dedicated customer support team who I will share their email at the end of the webinar, so that if you do have any questions about the more sort of admin side of things, you can get in touch with them and they'll be able to set up a call with you. So yes, we'll have a look now at the different games that students can play within the platform and that you will see throughout the primary guided course, and have a think about how we might use them as front of class activities. So if a student goes into listening, they'll have the choice of doing 3 games. The first 2 are multiple choice and snap. So you can see screenshots from the games just popped up on my screen. So obviously with multiple choice, you hear the audio in the target language, and that's French or Spanish. Apologies for people with Spanish teachers here. Most of the examples today are just in French, just because that was what I opened when I was making the PowerPoint, but it's very, very similar, and the games are exactly the same for both French and Spanish. But yes, with multiple choice, they will hear the target language and they will choose the correct option for the translation of that phrase or word. And then with snap, they can press the audio on the right hand card, and if that matches the English on the left hand side, they can click snap, and if it doesn't, they can then shuffle through the deck until they do find one that matches the English. And both of these games, if you were to use them in the front of class, the kind of games that you could easily do on mini whiteboards. So with multiple choice, you could label those 4 options A, B, C, D, and have students show their answer as you go through as a class. And with snap, for example, you could have a letter S if they think it's a snap, and NS or just an N if they think it's not a snap. And then again, they could show those as you go through those. So you can do that as a whole class activity, or if you want them writing things down in their books, that's something where they can write down the numbers as well. The other game we have in listening is Word Pop. And this is quite a nice one. If you're using it as a front of class activity, you'll see that normally the suggestion in the lesson plans, and there always will be a suggestion in the lesson plan for how you might want to do this, would be that you maybe get students up and out of their seats, up at the front of the class, at the whiteboard, popping the bubbles, and they sort of listen to the audio in the middle card, and then pop the correct bubble that has the translation in there. So quite a nice one to do, maybe as a more front of class activity. For reading, so when a student's doing a reading assignment or going through the reading for that particular set of vocabulary, they have the choice of 4 games. Matching pairs is one that we saw just now on a previous slide, where again it does what it says in the tin. You can see the translations in the target language around the side, which then need to be dragged onto the correct card. Again, this is something that you could get students coming up and doing at the front of the class. I think probably quite nice as a front of class activity. And you also get timer, so if you wanted to bring one student up to do it all, time them, and then see if somebody else could beat their time or get pairs up, then that again, it can get that timer element in there to build a bit of competition. We also have a multiple choice reading, where again you could label those A to B, A to D even, and have students working on that way. We do have a translation section in the reading area, which is where students will need to translate from the target language into English. And again, this is something that probably would be a useful thing to do either on mini whiteboards, or they could write translations into books or on scrap paper if you're using it as a front of class activity. Or as I said, all of these games as they've been assigned are the kind of games that if they open their laptops, go into their assignments, students can do in their own time. Last game is Word Pop, and obviously it's very, very similar to the Word Pop in the listening, just with the English written out in the card on the middle rather than audio. So those are our sort of more receptive games. We then also have the ability for students to practice vocabulary across speaking and writing. Now, speaking, we'll never have embedded a speaking activity into a lesson plan or a slideshow, just because the practicalities of getting a whole class to say a word, our voice recognition software would probably struggle to mark the pronunciation correctly. But the speaking is something that, if you set the vocabulary as an assignment, is something that the kids can do in their own time. If they've got access to a microphone or a device at home. You've either got the speech practice over here on the right, which is slightly more scaffolded, allows them to play the target language phrase and then record themselves sort of reading that out loud, and our software will then decide whether or not they pronounced it correctly. Or on the left hand side over here, it's a slightly harder activity where not only do they have to pronounce the phrase correctly, but they also need to remember what the French is, so you don't have the prompt there for them. I should say as well, if you're not familiar with it, all of these games are self-marked, and the nice thing about them is that students, if they do make a mistake, they have 2 chances to have a go at repeating that mistake, or to get it right afterwards. So they do get multiple chances to have a go at these activities. And finally, we have our writing section in the vocabulary, which is our 3 games of Blast Off, Skyrise and Word Pod. Blast Off is more likely, Blast Off in terms of in the course, we see Blast Off earlier on, as it is a bit more scaffolded. You see this you get the phrase or the word up there in blocks at the top, and then once the rocket takes off, they all fall down, and the students have to drag those back up to the top. So again, a nice one to get kids up to the front of the class and dragging things around on the screen, either one letter at a time or a word at a time, or something that they could then reproduce on a mini whiteboard. And obviously, because they've seen the phrase to begin with, it is slightly easier than the other 2 activities we have, which is Skyrise and Word Pod, where they don't get that to begin with. It's sort of more just a straight translation activity, where they either write the straight translation for Word Pod, or if it's Skyrise, they write the translation, and that will then be hooked over by our crane and dropped into the skyscraper, which they build progressively throughout the game. So those writing games are potentially something that will come in later in the course, particularly to stretch sort of like older learners, but are the kind of things that, as I said, they can practice with from day 1, from that year 3 onwards. Moving on to phonics. So I said that I'd talk a bit about phonics this week when I did the webinar a couple of weeks ago. The difference with our phonics lessons is that we don't really mind about the translations of the words. It's more about focusing on a pair of sounds. In this case, with French, we've got un and on. And it's about really getting in touch with those sounds, how they're pronounced. And so in terms of the students practicing them within the lessons, there'll be lots and lots of sort of choral repetition with that. And with the choral repetition, again, if you missed the webinar a couple of weeks ago, we did a whole section on choral repetition in that. So again, do drop us an email if you'd like to get the material for that. But again, with the phonics, all of the games that we have in phonics are embedded within the lessons and within the slideshows, but you do also have the opportunity to assign it to students so that they can have a go at it on their own devices. So again, if you've got time at the beginning of the day, or if you do have a school where students do have access to devices, if you assign this content, they'll have a chance to practice it in their own time. And as you can see, we've got 4 different games: phonics, catapult, imposter, penguin and concert, all of which, as I said, can be used as front of class activities or individual tasks. With catapult, again, it's all about learning the pronunciation, getting to grips with the sounds of the language. So in this particular activity, you can play the 2 audios at the bottom on the melons, and the idea is they decide which of those audios matches the word at the top, so pon, and once they've decided which of them matches the word, they'll then drag the correct melon into the sling, which, if they're correct, they'll be then able to shoot at the conveyor belt at the back. We then also have imposter, so a nice one to do as a front of class activity. Again, if you wanted to do it with mini whiteboards, you could have a tick or a cross. The idea is that you play the audio on top of the little sheep's head and decide whether or not it matches the word in the sheep's body. So if you believe that it matches, you could get students to write a tick and hold up the whiteboard. If you think that it's wrong, get them to write a cross, and if you all think it's wrong, then you drag that sheep into the pen and to see whether or not it is the wolf in sheep's clothing. So yeah, nice one potentially to play as a front of class activity. Feed the penguin as well as another drag and drop, slightly easier phonics game where all the students need to do is listen to the audio and decide whether or not, in this case, the sound in the word is on or un, and then drag the fish into the mouth of the penguin so that they can basically decide whether or not that is correct, and they'll get another go if they're not. And finally, another speaking game, so not a game that will be included in the slideshow element of the course, but is available to set as an assignment. The slideshow, this speaking game called Concert. Basically, the students build their own band. They record themselves saying out loud one of those words that they'll have practiced in this set for phonics. And if they get the correct pronunciation, they will then slowly add new members to the band until there are quite a few people on stage. So another nice fun one for them to do in their own time. So those are our phonics games, and the last type of game that you'll come across on the course is our sentence building games. And all of these, as I said, are, of course, as you can see, hopefully are games that can be done either as a whole group at the front of the class or individually. We do suggest that with sentence building weeks that you run it as a competition, so you can set up a competition, and that's another thing that our customer support can help you with. If that's something you'd be keen to do with your school, they can help you set that up. But of all weeks, this is a nice week where students are basically bringing together everything that they've done that term. They've moved on from a sort of single word level to a sentence level, and they have therefore got a separate group of games based around sentence building to vocabulary. So again, you can assign that from the Learn screen or from the individual games for sentence building, and there are 4 different games that students can practice: Skyrise, dictation, bridge magnets, and translation across this sentence building activity. So those practice all sorts of different skills. So with fridge magnets, probably the most supported, where they just drag and drop the sentence into the correct order. Dictation will be one where, again, if you're doing it as a front of class activity, it's probably one where you're going to need students either to be writing this down either on a mini whiteboard or in a book or on a scrap piece of paper, and so they'll listen out to the French or the Spanish, and then they'll write that phrase down. And then Skyrise and translation, once again, are sort of straight translation activities where they look at the English and they think, right, what is this going to mean in French or Spanish? And as I said, all of these, while we do encourage this week to be one where you maybe run a competition, get students on devices if possible, we have still obviously got all of this written out and built into a slideshow so that if you do want to do it as a front of class activity, it's also possible as well. So those are a huge number of sort of Languagenut games. Hopefully you've got more of a feel for them now if you weren't as familiar with the platform, and if you were familiar with the platform, you've got a few more ideas about how you might use them as a front of class activity with a whole group to sort of get that sort of enjoyment going in class. What we're going to move on to look at now for Q&A is some of the more sort of generic MFL games that come up time and time again in the course. These games are the kind of games that as well students will be learning and doing at Key Stage 3. So it's a nice way to sort of build continuous between the 2 key stages and ease transition as if they're familiar already with these kind of games at primary school. And that's the idea of sort of including them here. All of the games, including the ones that aren't Languagenut, will be fully explained in the lesson plans. So when you go into your guided course, into your year group, you can access lesson plans either through the half term. So if you click on the little printer icon here, you'll get the knowledge organizer for that half term plus the pack of lesson plans. Or if you go into an individual lesson, such as week 1 greetings, you can then access the lesson plan from the dashboard for that lesson. So you can also open it up as a PDF for that particular lesson, as well as downloading the pack. And the lesson plans are essentially give you a run, like a play-by-play, activity-by-activity breakdown of exactly what happens in the slides, in the front of class slides. So they work really, really well hand in hand together. There'll be nothing in the lesson plan that isn't in the slides and vice versa. And as I said, this is what our lesson plans look like if you haven't joined us before. And for now, we'll look on the left-hand side, we'll focus on the teaching and learning activities, as this is where you'll get all of your sort of instructions, essentially, for the different games and the different activities within the lessons. As I said, we're going to focus on activities that recur and come up all time and time again, but any activity that you've got in your lesson will be explained fully here. So again, if you are somebody who's new to teaching languages in the classroom or less confident with the language that you're teaching, if you follow this, you should feel fairly well supported and able to deliver. So first of all, of the games that we're going to look at that are also in the guided course, we've got Splat. So the first couple of games sort of testing listening comprehension, are the kind of games you might play once you've done quite a few rounds of sort of choral repetition, you've introduced the vocabulary for that lesson and students are familiar with the pictures on the flashcards. And the idea would be that you would divide your class into 2 teams, maybe team A and team B, and pick 1 student from each team to come to the front of the class. So that then what you would then do, and again, if you are less confident with the language at this stage, you could freeze the screen and go back to the learn screen where you can then play the audio for the target language. And so the idea would be as you play at random one of the words or phrases from that lesson, and of the 2 students, the student who is fastest to tap the correct picture that corresponds with that vocabulary gets a point for their team. And then you could run that as a winner stays on, or you could then get an entirely fresh pair to come up to the front, and so on until you're happy that the game's over. One I would recommend probably for the end of a lesson rather than the beginning, as it can get quite rowdy, but definitely one that students tend to enjoy and find a lot of fun. It's a good way to get them really practicing with the vocabulary for the lesson. Another game in a similar vein is Beat the Teacher. So instead of having your class divided into 2 teams, you now have the whole class versus the teacher. And again, the idea, it works with the flashcards from the lesson and the pictures, and so you can display the pictures or the flashcards from the lesson on the screen, or alternatively, if you think their students need a bit more support, you could show the learn screen and get rid of the English. But the idea is that you would then read out or play one of the vocabulary items from the lesson while pointing to one of your pictures. If what you say matches the picture you pointed to, then the students will repeat after you in the target language. However, if what you point to doesn't match what you said, and the students are supposed to stay silent, and if they all manage to stay silent, then the class gets a point. But if a couple of them repeat after you and you've got it wrong and pointed to the wrong picture, then the teacher gets a point. And again, it can build a nice bit of camaraderie and a bit of healthy competition between the class and the teacher, and you can let them think that they're better at the language than you are. And again, with all of these, we'll talk about it next week. If you do have sort of somebody who's more of a native speaker in your class, again, this is one of those situations where you could get them up to the front and they could be the ones to read it out. And so it's class versus the student, if you've got somebody who's confident enough to do that, of course. So yeah, Beat the Teacher, another fun one. And as I said before, obviously all of these instructions are there in the lesson plan, so you'll be able to see this is, in this particular case, it's activity 3, and all of those instructions are sort of talk through them as you go through. One that most people probably are familiar with is Simon Says, or Jacques a dit, or Simon disait. In this case, obviously it works a little bit better if you've got a set of vocabulary that corresponds well with actions. A really good idea to link vocabulary learning to actions. It's just another thing that helps students really embed it and remember it. So obviously in this case we've got a lesson that's about classroom instructions, and so once you've sort of introduced it and students are happier with the vocabulary, you can play Jacques a dit, and the idea would be you'd say Jacques a dit and then one of the actions from that lesson, so maybe asseyez-vous, at which point the students will recognise that that is the word for sit down, and if you've said Simon Says or Jacques a dit or Simon disait at the beginning, they will then repeat that action. But if you haven't said Jacques a dit or Simon disait at the beginning of that phrase, then they will stay where they are. So it's a nice way of them showing you that they've understood the vocabulary while also being a bit of fun with the game as well. Again, moving on to sort of more presentation of vocabulary that we have is conducteur or chef d'orchestre. The idea with this is it sort of usually comes after the choral repetition phrase, as it's a nice way to build pronunciation without it feeling too high stakes. What you would do is pick a student to be a detective, get them to step outside the room, and then while they're outside of the room, choose another student to be the conductor and give them a secret signal, ideally quite a subtle one, like rubbing the nose or something subtle. Once that's decided, bring the detective back into the room, at which point you get the class to start chanting the first word in the vocabulary set. When they feel like it, the conductor can then do their secret signal, and when the conductor's done that, the class moves on to chanting the next vocabulary item in the list. And so they're building that pronunciation while the detective tries to work out who the conductor is. And again, you can choose how many guesses you give them, usually about 3. 3 wrong guesses means that they then have lost, and the person who was the conductor can then have a go at being the detective, and so on. Moving on, another good one to work with when you're practicing pronunciation as a group, which again can sometimes, when practicing as a group, can feel less daunting than practicing on your own, is the who is it, or c'est qui est. And with this one, it's quite a nice idea. So you get a student up to the front of the classroom who sits at the front with their back to the rest of the class, at which point secretly you will then point to a student who can disguise their voice and say, in this case we've got an example where it might be creating a sentence such as je m'appelle plus a different name, or it could just be as simple as reading one of the vocabulary items from that lesson in a disguised voice, and the person at the front of the class has to try and guess who it is sort of saying that. And again, they get 3 guesses, and if they get it wrong, they switch. So again, a nice way to get different students practicing that pronunciation while also having them have a bit of fun. The counting game is one that's probably used, I've seen used across different subjects, so is one that probably most people are quite familiar with. It works particularly well with sequences, so numbers, months, days of the year. If you've got a sequence, the idea is that everybody will close their eyes ideally, and then without planning or conspiring, the idea is to get from start to finish and reading the numbers, in this case out in the target language, de toi, without 2 people saying them at the same time. So you can speak at any time, but if 2 people say the number at the same time, then you go back to the beginning. So again, nice way of practicing the pronunciation. And doesn't necessarily, if you do want to just do it with a set of vocabulary and go from sort of left to right, then that's fine as well. But as I said, works particularly well with sequences. So moving on, hopefully, as I said, I'm rattling through this, so I'm aware of time. As I said, do let me know if you fancy getting the PowerPoint after the session. So moving on now to more sort of sentence level games, and so we've got trapdoor activity, which is a great way to practice not only pronunciation but also get your students used to slightly longer sentences. The idea here is, you can see top left, any of these activities like trapdoor, we'll have this printout in the slideshow so you can do it and model it as a front of class activity, but then we'll also include this sort of trapdoor activity in the lesson plan at the end. So if you scroll through the lesson plan and there's sort of another activity like this, it will then be there at the end of the lesson plan for you to print. So again, if you want then students to work on it in pairs or in threes, then you can do that afterwards. But the idea with trapdoor is that you secretly choose one option from each of the trapdoors, which are in the blue boxes, and then pick a student to read the sentence and to guess which option they've chosen. So they might, in this case, say l'anniversaire de mon ami, and if they've got that correct and that's the one you've chosen, you let them carry on, and then they'll say et le, and then they might choose 16. And then that might not be the one that you've chosen, in which case if they've got it wrong, they then send them right back to the beginning, and then when you're modelling it, you might then want to choose another student to carry on from the start. But then the idea then would be to then break them off into pairs and have them practicing it on their own, so they get used to those structures and those longer sentences, but also practicing their pronunciation. I'm Thinking of a Sentence is another game similar to Trapdoor. We've got quite a lot of sort of sentence building activities within the platform that we're going to look at more in next week's session. The idea is that you'd pick an option from each of the columns in the grid, and that would then create a whole sentence or a whole couple of sentences. And again, in this case, you could then secretly pick one option from each column and then pick students to read one item from each column out to you and to try and guess whether or not the sentence you've got is right. And you can choose how you reveal they're right. You might say, well, you got column 1 correct, column 3 correct, but not 2 or 4, or just send them back to the beginning like we did with Trapdoor, depending on how much time you have, I guess. So another nice sentence level activity. Treasure hunt and battleships, again, it's a fairly familiar one. Again, is a really nice way in the MFL context to get students building sentences or using words and phrases together. So again, the gameplay is fairly familiar, I'm sure, to everyone. You get this printed off, as this will be provided in the lesson plan, and in pairs, students can then secretly choose 3 squares and take it in turns to guess where their partner has chosen their squares by reading out something from the left-hand column and from the row at the top. So il neige dans le sud, and then it depends on the partner understanding and being able to translate that sort of sound to writing and to be able to work out whether or not, yes, they've got one of their hidden squares or they haven't, and whoever gets the 3 first wins. Pictionary and charades doesn't need too much explaining. Again, as I said before, it's really good to linking actions, pictures to words. It's just another really nice way of embedding vocabulary in the MFL classroom. So we do include Pictionary and charades games throughout the course. Bingo is another one, an old favourite, where again, particularly with any set of vocabulary, students can pick up to sort of 5 words, either write them down in a grid or write them down on a mini whiteboard, and again you can then either play or read out at random the different words, and it does build comprehension. It builds that link between the sound and the writing. So again, it's not just a game. All of these are designed to sort of build language awareness, build vocabulary awareness, as well as being fun and as well as being engaging. Last 2 games before we get to Q&A, we've got Kim's game, another familiar one, another good one to use when you've got students that are a bit more familiar with the vocabulary, so maybe a smaller set. And the idea is that when I click the next slide in the platform, one of those animals in this case will disappear, and you will have to get students to put their hand up and tell you in the target language which of the animals has gone from the screen. And again, it can be up to you. We'll talk more about support and challenge next session. But in the game like this, you might have wanted to print stock a vocabulary list so that students have that there with them, or you can get it to do it as a straight recall where they don't have any support if they're a bit more confident. Last game, and it's not a game as such, it's more just a way of making memorising fun, and it's to time yourself and a timer game. So if you particularly, again, if you've got sequences like months of the year, days of the week, and numbers, it's a nice game where you can get students to sort of time each other in pairs to sort of read them out as fast as they can in order. And then once you've given them a chance to practice, nominate 2 or 3 students in the class to come up to the front and see if they can see how quickly they can recite the vocabulary that you've been learning that lesson. And the winner would be the person who manages to say it as fast as they can, but also keeps their pronunciation. So again, the idea is to reward the correct pronunciation rather than somebody who can sort of garble out or the numbers 1 to 10 as quickly as they can without having thought about what they're saying. But yeah, a nice way of building a bit of competition in the class while also getting them essentially just to learn the vocabulary that you've been covering in the lesson. So yes, a whirlwind stop of lots of different MFL games. Again, some of them may have already been very familiar, some of them may have not been things that you've come across before. Hopefully we might have a little bit of time for Q&A. I think my colleague David has been manning the chat while I've been going through. But yes, do let me know if you've got any questions.
You must have been super clear because there's only one question so far, which is, please can you tell me when German will have the same resources as French and Spanish, like knowledge organisers, songs and stories, and the primary guided course for German?
So German is a language that obviously we're keen to add at some point. At the moment, it will be based on demand. So obviously, the more people that ask for it, the more likely we will be to add it. Obviously, we've chosen French and Spanish initially as those are the most widely sort of taught languages in UK primary schools at present. But again, it doesn't mean that we won't then be working on developing extra languages in the future. So yes, hopefully that's answered that for you. And as I said, in 1 second, I will just put my email. That's my email at the top. So if you would like any of the slides from this presentation, do let me know. Drop me an email. And then equally, if you're not a subscriber and would like a trial, or if you are a subscriber and would like more support with things like the admin side of things and setting students up, setting assignments, then do feel free to email our customer support email address at languagenut.com, and I'll be able to answer any questions that you might have. And if we have no further questions, I will probably leave you all to your evening. And yes, as I said, the recording for this will be sent round as soon as our tech team have got it ready for you. So yes, unless there are any other questions.
No more questions.
I'll say ta-ra. Thank you very much.
Oh, hang on, last question. Are you planning to add Italian to the guided course in the future?
I think likewise with the German, again, these languages is all about demand. If we get lots and lots of teachers asking for them, then yes. But in the short term, we went with the French and Spanish. It's a huge project getting them ready, and we based them off ones that we had lesson plans for already. So it doesn't mean that we won't add new ones in the future. But hopefully, as I said, it'll be based on how many people we have sort of asking for it.
Great stuff.
Fab. Well, if there are no more, then yeah, I'll see you next week hopefully, and yeah, everybody have a lovely weekend.